Welcome back, everyone, to the Global AI Summit. I'm James Harding, the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And this, for me, is like a trip to the cookie jar. It's a chance, really, to feast on the shared experience and knowledge of the intersection between AI, what's happening in the world of tech, and what's happening in the world of power and politics. This next session is really focused on geopolitics, but it's revisiting the New World Order. It's trying to understand the lens of power in the context of AI developing capabilities. And we're really fortunate that we've got a group of people who I hope are going to bring very different points of view, different expertise to bear. The one thing I wanted to say is that I make this introduction about think-ins frequently. It's probably most important in an area like this. I've often found that when I go to panel events or when I go to conferences or even lectures, there's this sense that the wisdom of the room is lost. There are only the handful of people up on the stage who are speaking, and there are all these people who've got experience and expertise, and you just don't hear from them. And the idea of a tortoise think-in is that everyone can weigh in. Please do that in the chat. It will be great to hear your points of view and thoughts in the chat. But what I'll also do is bring you into the conversation to make sure that you can put your points of view to the really exceptional group of people who are going to be discussing this subject over the course of nearly the next hour, 45, 50 minutes or so. And they are Benedict Evans, who is one of, I think probably the best, may actually be the best writer on what's happening in the world of tech today, was probably had the best perch on the industry at Andreessen Horowitz, is now, I'm happy to say, back in London and is writing and thinking about it. And I hope will give us, Benedict, a sense of how you see this world changing and where you think the PowerPoints are. Kasper Klunge is, or was the tech ambassador to Denmark. I was having a conversation the day before yesterday, Kasper, with Jan Gehl, the great Danish architect. And it always seems as though Denmark not only has Denmark, but also the best designations for people. Jan as an urbanist and you as a tech ambassador. But now, of course, from your position at Microsoft, I hope we'll have a view of the intersection between nation states and these great tech nations that we see developing. If you're interested in this area, Azim Azhar is one of those people you really don't need to introduce. Exponential View is one of those things you have to read. I confess now to him that I not only am a devotee, Azim, but also then rip off your ideas as my own. So it's a good place to make that apology public. And we're just chasing the Secretary of State for Digitization in Spain, Carme Artigas, who's going to join us in a moment. So Azim, can I start with you? The reason I wanted to just scroll through that carousel of slides is it's very easy to talk about a global AI race, but hard to actually comprehend what's at stake here. And I just wondered, when you look at the map of the world, if you look at the New World Order, how you see things.
Thank you, James, and great to be here with so many august thinkers and some of my friends as well, which is wonderful. And my friends are also august thinkers. Perhaps we should just start with how I look at AI. I mean, I think of AI as a tool. It is a technology. It is a telescope, a spreadsheet, a ladder. It's something that, in some sense, we are familiar with, but it is also something that has a certain transformative potential in industries, in economies, and also, therefore, in areas of military. We would think about it as a classic general purpose technology, a technology that can be applied in many different places in an industry and in many different industries, a technology that drives down the price of particular types of things. In this case, it is things like whether you can make a prediction about something or whether you can optimize something, and as a consequence will give rise to complementary products, and it will substitute for activities that we otherwise do in more traditional ways. So in that sense, it's really quite powerful. And in the context of any international competition, there are benefits to being very good at it, and there are benefits to getting it first. And that, I think, is just a really important framing, because we can historicize how we think about AI in the context of other technologies that we have seen develop over the last couple of hundred of years. There are certain distinct characteristics about it, though, which are just the domains where it can enter have been so uniquely expensive and kludgy in some ways that I think it does present real opportunities for nations or companies to leapfrog. And a simple example is what we saw earlier this week with DeepMind and AlphaFold, where this new system was able to crack a 50-year-old scientific problem and may open up new industrial vistas. But that's not the only thing that is going on in this space. So I think what we have here is a general purpose technology that could rewrite many rules of society the way other general purpose technologies like electricity and the steam engine did. And at the same time, that confers advantages to those who get there first. And I think where we've been talking about this for a few years, I mean, the interesting place to get to is, what are we really learning about that after 3 or 4 years of sort of this international competition?
And as you can ask you just about that, the AlphaFold thing makes it real for people. One of the questions that we've got is around clustering. And if you kind of take a real world contemporary analogy, you can see what's happened with a company like Salesforce, and that there are around 5,000 companies now that exist in the ecosystem of Salesforce. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes a hub for innovation and employment and technological development of its own. Do you see in AI yet any clear clusters in places that are developing that will give us a sense of where the nodes of power might be?
Well, clusters are really critical. I mean, we've got Benedict, who's spent many years in the most important technology cluster in the world, which was Silicon Valley, and we're starting to see clusters emerge in AI. So of course there's still Silicon Valley, there is Montreal in Canada, there are the various clusters in the big conurbations in China, and in the UK, the research triangle that lives between Cambridge in particular, but also London and to some extent Oxford, is also an important cluster. And I think the way that we have to understand AI is, what does AI require? I mean, AI tools require computation that can live anywhere. It requires data that can be moved anywhere. It requires places where you can apply these technologies, which means you need to have digital services and you need to have regulatory regimes that are open to experiment. That is a choice that a government has. And then finally, it needs talent. And one of the things that we must sort of recognize is that smart people like to work with smart people, and it's pretty lonely if you're the only data scientist in the room. It's much more fun to have a few of your peers who can critique your work and help you think constructively about these things. So I think clusters are important. They are, in a sense, they're humanity's oldest story, from the earliest cities when we started to cluster and exchange and specialize. That mathematics remains the same.
Azim, I'll come back to you in a moment, but I see that Carmen Artigas has joined us. Carmen, thank you very much for being here. One of the reasons we were really keen to have you join us is that the truth is that when Alexandra Musavizadeh and the team started looking at creating an index for AI, there were almost no ministers or secretaries of state for artificial intelligence. I think actually UAE had probably the first, but there was next to none. And now suddenly there are more and more countries that have them. There are very few that, like Spain, have someone like you who actually built a business in AI. I think Synergic Partners founded in 2006. Right? So you've really been in this for a while and now find yourself in the politics of it. I'm just interested to know how much you think government can do, what government can do to help develop the kind of capabilities and clusters that Azim was just talking about.
So thank you very much for launching this glove to me. And thank you, of course, for inviting me to this session. Congratulate you for this summit. Yes, in my professional career, it happened to me that I've been in all the different sides of the coin. I was venture capital CEO of Ericsson Innova at the European level in year 1999. So it was the emergency of 3G and the wireless internet so long ago. Then I founded my own business in 2006, which was a startup on big data and AI, which is very, very early times, one of the first in Europe. So I was on the other side, not giving money to entrepreneurs, but being my entrepreneur myself. Then I sold my company to Telefonica Group in 2015. Then I had the challenge to integrate an innovation company into a big company and challenge all the cultural issues that you have when a big corporation acquires a small one. And now I'm on the other side in the public sector, trying to promote entrepreneurship and promote the new opportunities that of economic growth thanks to AI. And probably I have a unique perspective of all the roadblocks that should be removed so that the entrepreneurs, especially in Spain, do not be heroes, because it's like being an entrepreneur in Europe is being a hero. And you shouldn't be a hero. You should be people with capabilities, with support, with entrepreneurial ideas, and having access to funding, to talent. And that's the challenge. And Azim was just pointing the right issues. The challenge we have is access to data, access to computer power, access to financing, but above all, access to talent. And there is a global talent war. And that's one of the challenges that Europe needs to solve, because there's a fierce competency at a global level. I don't know if you want me to point it out, James, on that, or you want to just raise questions on.
I'd love to talk about the global talent war, right? You don't hear people put it quite as starkly as that. And I don't know how you think of it. Do you think that Spain is competing in that war, Europe is competing in that war, the West is competing in that war? How do you approach the geopolitics of it?
Yeah, so this is a good day for me, because just yesterday we made it public, our national strategy on AI. And this is the first thing I did when I took my position. I joined the position in February the 16th, and then on March the 12th, we were all confined. Well, locked down. And I don't know if you can imagine to just start in a place when you don't know your team yet, you're just recruiting online via Zoom, and then you start managing a pandemic at a national level by Zoom. Yeah. And it's been very, very hard in terms of cultural adoption. I remember one day when we moved from 5,000 procedures online. I'm responsible for the digital administration, the e-government part of the administration, and we moved from 5,000 procedures online. I don't know, tramitations. I don't know what's the right name in English. From 5,000 to 90,000 overnight. Wow. We have a scale up 500 times the number of electronic procedures with the citizens, and all these challenges have done with people teleworking, also public servants teleworking when they had never teleworked before. So the challenges we're facing with the pandemic are unique. The difference between being in or out, the difference between keeping some economic activity or not, or even allowing your children to go to school or not, has depended on a connectivity, a PC, and some basic digital skills. And that is when all the digital gaps have erased in a very, very dramatic way. Hopefully in Spain, we have a unique network of connectivity. We are the #1 country in the world in fiber optics network. We have more kilometers of fiber optics than France, UK, Germany, and Italy together. And this is because of the last 15 years investments, but that is not enough. Just having access to connectivity is not enough. You need to have access to some basic digital skills of citizenship. And probably while we are very good in terms of global comparison in the ASI index on connectivity and digital government, we are lagging behind on our digitalization of our small and medium enterprises, which are just 90% of our economic tissue, more than 3 million small and medium enterprises, and in also on the digital literacy of our citizenship. So these are two important things to build, because we can find just the controversy that in Spain we could have like a 14% of structural unemployment, and however we need to fill 2 million jobs that we don't find in our country because we don't have the right talent. And that's what we want to focus on, creating all these new skills from a primary, secondary education, focusing on high-skilled people on universities, and also on the technology transfer and know-how transfer between academia and industry.
I'm going to come to Benedict Evans in a moment, but I'm just really interested, because the implication of what you say is that Spain needs to make big changes on the infrastructure to allow that spread of deep digital connectivity, and on its schooling and educational infrastructure to have the pools of talent. It was a very similar story to the UK. But the question is the AI race a race of mass mobilization, i.e. you need to have very, very large numbers of people who have a base level of digital skills, or is it an elite competition? Is it going to be defined by small groups, clusters of academics, companies, innovators that have massive access to capital and the very, very best in resources? And I wondered, when you sat and you did Spain's AI strategy, although the first is much more attractive politically because it's much more fairer and inclusive, but in terms of competitiveness, whether or not you think the second is closer to the truth.
This is national AI strategy, just one of the building blocks of our national agenda, which is called España Digital, so Digital Spain 2025. So last July, we presented our digital agenda, which is like 10 lines of action that include a national plan for digital skills, cybersecurity strategy, our, let's say, modernization of our public digital services. That includes the transition towards a data economy from big micro sectors of our industry. So it's a very compelling strategy. Of course, 5G deployment, our audiovisual sector. So there's a very compelling strategy where AI is a piece. We cannot afford to look at one place without looking the other. We need to make all these transformations because we are lagging behind in some of these basic pillars. And we need to promote this transition towards a data economy and support digital entrepreneurship. And that's a very important topic we need to make focus of. The good thing is that even though the pandemic has put all these things that we know were important, the pandemic has made them urgent. Mm-hmm. So we already have assessed what were the diagnosis was correct. The measures are correct. We have this roadmap. We have a real plan with some key measures, KPIs. We know what to do. What we have also lacked is lack of leadership and lack of resources. But now we have it all. We have leadership, and now we have the resources thanks to the recovery plans. So the European recovery plans give us the unique opportunity to really not putting our country in the place we were before the pandemic. That's not the place I want to be. I want to be in a different place. I want to be in a place where the economy is more resilient, more sustainable, that we can get this opportunity to not do only the conjunctural changes, but the structural changes. Right. We need to put our economy. We are not on a bad starting point. I've made a recent study supported by Boston Consulting Group, and the digital economy of Spain, if we consider all the direct, indirect, and derived impacts of our digital economy, already account for 19% of our gross net product, of our national gross net product, 19%. Just the second sector after construction. If it was a sector, if a digital economy was a sector, it would be the second one in Spain. But we are aiming to become a 40% of the contribution of the digital economy. We aim to become 40% of our global economy. And that's a transition we need to approach in the following 3 to 5 years.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you in a moment. But Benedict, can I come to you? Listen, they say there's no such thing as a stupid question. I'm going to test that idea to destruction in the next 5 minutes, because I wanted to start by asking you whether you think there is a read across from the development of Silicon Valley to what happens in the global race for AI?
So I'll answer the question perhaps in a slightly unexpected way, which is that Silicon Valley began in defense electronics. It began in making radar, missile guidance systems, and so on for the US military after the Second World War. And it became a semiconductor business maybe in the 60s. It became a database business, a hard disk place. There's no semiconductors left in Silicon Valley anymore. All the silicon is made in South Korea and Taiwan, mainly Taiwan. And so Silicon Valley has been sort of a fundamentally different technology every 10 to 15 years since the Second World War. And, picking up on something that Azim said, giving sort of a slightly different sort of way of framing some of the points that Azim made. Machine learning, and I don't use the word AI because I think AI is a deeply unhelpful term. It makes us think that this is some radically different thing. Machine learning is just a new way of writing software. And so it's useful in that kind of historical timeline of Silicon Valley. It's very useful to compare it with databases, and particularly relational databases, which arrived in the late 70s and early 80s. And allowed you to manipulate and store and manage data in completely new ways. And relational databases are the reason why Zara can get something from a whiteboard or a sketchbook to the store in a week. They're the reason why Apple can run a global distributed supply chain. They are the reason why most of the modern business around us that we see around us is able to function, because they're able to move data around. And if you had said in 1980, we need to have a database strategy, that might have seemed like a very urgent and pressing and important problem. And you might have come back in 1980 and said, we've completely failed to implement databases. All of this stuff is still on paper, and those businesses that are still managing things on reel-to-reel tapes and not able to organize data in that way are going to fall behind. And why didn't we have a database strategy? But today, when you order food delivery, you don't say, I'm going to use some SQL now. It just disappears inside everything else. And so saying that you should have a AI strategy is a bit like saying that you should have a cloud strategy, or that you should have a no-code strategy. I mean, it's just one of many enabling layers that are happening inside software. Now, to kind of argue against that and pull that apart slightly, it does seem to me that there are sort of two almost sort of parallel tracks in machine learning. One of them is people who are picking up this technology and working out progressively more and more interesting things that you can do with it. Because what machine learning lets you do very crudely is pattern recognition of a kind that you couldn't do with computers before. And it turns out that folding proteins is pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. It turns out that X or Y or Z is actually pattern recognition. And so there is a sort of frontier science element to this stuff. But the other side of this is, I was looking at a presentation from Vodafone a while ago, talking about what they call digital transformation, which sounds like the kind of thing you see on a slogan for enterprise software in an airport. But what that means is Vodafone has 2.6 million invoices a year. And they have something over 1,000 people processing those invoices. And most of those invoices are on paper. And they come in paper and they get scanned and put into an Oracle database. But then basically people have to look at all of those invoices and process them. And machine learning means that they think they'll go from 1,000 people processing them to 100 people processing them and do them much more efficiently and understand what's going on inside them. And that's kind of the stuff that happened with databases. One side of databases was, well, what does this mean for how the police could track us? And what does this mean for civil rights and employment? But the other side of it was, you can make a phone call to your bank and they can tell you what your balance is, like right away.
Yeah.
Instead of having to mail it to you. It's really, really boring stuff. And so when I hear these sort of phrases of, we need to have AI strategy, we need to have AI talent, I feel like that's the wrong level of abstraction. It's rather as though you had said, how do we build a strategy to have more journalists in our country?
Right. But Benedict, that doesn't seem as eccentric to me as it might do to you. I appreciate the point about machine learning and pattern recognition. The reason being that you might have said when Henry Ford let the Model T roll off the production line, this was just another step in the Industrial Revolution. It was another and different application of the combustion engine, but it wasn't. It was the car. and it was going to change the way in which we were all going to, travel. It was going to change the nature of the city. You can see my point. I wonder whether or not that, even if you accept your definition of machine learning and pattern recognition, which I see as the right one, that the consequences of those capabilities are so big for so many different industries and areas of public policy that you would want to have a strategy, and that you do realize that nation states are in a race to win.
Well, the problem is that a AI strategy, or is that a digitization strategy?
What's the difference?
Because in 5 years' time, look, how can I put this? I spent 6 years in Silicon Valley. Well, I'll give you a very specific microcosm. I spent 6 years in Silicon Valley. Sort of in 2013, if you had said, or 2012, if you said I want to work on machine learning, that was like a dumb idea from the 80s that had never worked. It was rather like saying I want to work on VR. 2013, people work out, oh, wow, this would work now. 2014, we start seeing companies saying, hi, I'm a PhD student. Here's my CV. I'm going to give me $10 million and I'll register a domain name. And then I'll start making AI. 2015, 16, you start seeing people saying, okay, I'm going to build a platform for image recognition. Or I'm going to build a platform for speech recognition. And I'm going to sell speech recognition to people who need speech recognition. 2018, 19, you start seeing you have companies where they say, I'm going to solve this very specific problem inside an industry. And it happens that I'm using AI to do it, because you couldn't really do that before. But I'm not selling AI or even image recognition. So, I mean, not to, just because the company that's in my mind, we invested in a company called People.ai, which does natural language processing on text going in and out of your sales process to work out which sales pipelines are going wrong. Now, that's an actual AI company. That's actual AI. But it's not an AI company. It's a sales process optimization company. And so to sit and say, like, we need to have a company to produce a strategy that will produce that would be kind of the wrong level of abstraction. Rather, you need to think, do we have a country where it's easy to build a startup? Do we have a country where lots of people are studying mathematics and computer science? Do we have a country do we have like a healthy university system? Are all of our, I think somebody did I don't know if it's in the index, but there's a study of the educational backgrounds of people who submit papers to NUITS, which is the kind of the premier conference for frontier science and machine learning. And what you see is that the distribution of papers at undergraduate level is what is the education of the people who submitted the papers. And the distribution by undergrad is fairly predictable. It's sort of EU, China, India, USA, and so on. At postgrad, the people who are in the EU have stayed in the EU. The people who are in the US have stayed in the US. 90% of the people who are in China and India have gone to the US. Right. So that's an interesting conversation. But that's not because of an AI strategy. That's because of universities and mathematics and visas. Mm-hmm. And that chart would have looked exactly the same 10 years ago when there were 10 people on Earth who thought that machine learning was a good idea. And they would have been going to study something else. And it will be the same in 10 years' time, when everybody has completely forgotten about machine learning in the same way that everyone has now completely forgotten about SQL. It'll just become part of everything.
So you're I'm going to come back to you in a moment. I want to bring in Casper too. I just want you to finish that point, Benedict. So then, to cheat, does that mean that you think, in the end, the outcome of this index is when we look 5-10 years, the things we're really looking at are, the capabilities I just touched on with Karma, connectivity and, intellectual capability, aka universities, and that puts the US in the lead?
Yeah, so I think there's a university question. I also think, I spent some time recently looking through Eurostat data, and I think you could propose that sort of Eurostat and equivalent bodies are where innovative technology, like by the time there is a time series, a survey in Eurostat of what percentage of this country has adopted X, that's the point that you don't care anymore. So, I swear to God, Eurostat collects data on how many enterprises are processing orders using EDI. And EDI was a dead technology when I started my career 20 years ago. Right. And so I think, yes, in 20 years' time, Eurostat will be connecting data on how many people are using machine learning inside of their companies. And that will be the point that it just has become totally meaningless. In the same way, it will slowly diffuse. It will disappear into everything. Every piece of software that you use will have some machine learning in it some way. But no one will know and no one will care.
Right.
And we'll be worrying about something else.
Let me. I'm going to come back in a second. I'm going to come to you in a moment. But Casper's been waiting with certainly greater patience and good grace than I would have shown. Casper, thank you. Casper, oh sorry, you're muted. I don't know whether that's us or you. There you are. Hello.
Combination.
A combination of both of us. Casper, the thing that's really interesting is you were a diplomat, right? I mean, you're, I think, ambassador to Indonesia for Denmark, if that's right, and then this tech ambassador to Silicon Valley. Tell me, when you listen to what Benedict was just saying, and a little about what Carmen was saying too, what do you think the intersection should be between innovation from the marketplace and direction from government?
Yeah, no, thanks. Listen, I was listening with interest on this conversation, and I'm happy to bring a heavy Danish accent into this discussion. So thanks for the invitation from you and Alexandra. Listen, I spent 3 years in Silicon Valley, and part of the job is, of course, to receive delegations from governments, from the private sector. And I don't think I've had any single delegation who didn't say sort of, how can we copy the ecosystem of Silicon Valley and bring that back to Europe? And I think, you know, I don't disagree with Benedict that there are a lot of misconceptions. I think there are specific cluster aspects of this that is really difficult to copy. But I think it's an expression of a sense of desperation in many countries, not least in Europe, but I would argue more globally, that there is a sense of this sort of geopolitical arms race, or the fact that some regions are trailing behind. And there's a lot of focus, of course, on the US, on China, and of course on the fact that Europe feels a little bit squeezed between a rock and a hard place, because we're not building perhaps the same number of big technology companies in Europe as they are in China and the US. I have to say, you know, coming from a diplomatic background, I was very, very interested for many years about the geopolitics of, you know, the big rivalry between the East and the West. I do think that one aspect that I'm increasingly interested in is also, you know, what does this geopolitical arms race mean for, you know, the South, for Africa, for Southeast Asia, for Latin America. And I think we're losing a little bit sometimes the perspective of how important that discussion is as well. Because I think one thing is crystal clear, you know, we do need AI strategies or ML strategies. We need cloud strategies. And I would just argue that it doesn't really matter what country you're in. The fact that you can tune in, get resources to better understand what's happening, and the significant impact on these new technologies is something that we should welcome, and that I think we need basically across the world. Because I think Carmen and James, yourself, Asim as well. And by the way, thanks for mentioning that you rip off Asim's ideas. We all do that, so it's great to come clean on live here on that. But I do think one important aspect that we've seen during COVID-19 is that, you know, AI or ML is such an important dimension, whether we're coping with a global pandemic or whether we're trying to bring, you know, companies into a digital economy. And it's not really a nice thing to have, it's a necessity. And therefore, I do think we need a lot more attention all over the world. But I'm sitting in Europe, certainly also in Europe, in better understanding and better preparing ourselves for the new reality.
And Casper, can I ask you a question about that? Now you're at Microsoft, I understand you're in charge of government affairs for Microsoft.
Yeah.
As you may be aware, we in this country are involved in a conversation about our future relationship with the EU.
I've heard about that.
And I should put it as warmly as we can.
Yeah.
The thing that's really interesting that we're coming to terms with and learning is that the European Union is not a, you know, defense superpower. It is, though, and this was Ivan Rogers, the former UK permanent representative to the EU's phrase, the EU is, though, a regulatory superpower. If you look at what it's done on GDPR and other areas like this, it really does punch above its weight as a regulatory force. Is that something that inhibits European development in AI or machine learning, or do you think it has the capacity to strengthen it?
Yeah, listen, I think that's the million or perhaps the billion-dollar question. And, you know, I've been spending a bit of time with Professor Arno Bradford and her ideas about the Brussels effect, which is basically what you're also saying, that the European Union is a superpower on the regulatory areas. And I think the discussion is very much based on sort of this notion that, you know, data is to some extent the only commodity that becomes more valuable the more of it you have. And is there a problem if the European Union regulates in a way where it becomes more difficult to get access to data, or as we've seen with the recent Schrems II decision, making it more difficult to transfer data between regions, in this case, between the US and Europe? We might come back and have this discussion again in 2-3 years. I have to say, I don't think that is the case, and I don't think there is sort of a contradiction between having some regulatory traffic rules in place and then building innovation and investing in innovation, making venture capital available also in Europe. But I would say one thing, and that is, if we focus on the regulatory agenda in Europe, we know that the European Commission will come forward with proposals for regulating AI in the new year. But we also know that it'll take probably a couple of years. It will probably not be until 2023, 2024 before that regulation will have gone through the different processes and be in place. Mm-hmm. So I think the big question is not necessarily whether the European Union will regulate in a way that makes AI innovation more difficult. I think there is a huge responsibility, including on the company that I now represent, in making sure that in the interim we self-regulate in a way where artificial intelligence doesn't violate, basic human rights, that it's done in a responsible way. And I think the trick to this, and there is a geopolitical dimension to that we might come back to, James, is, can we do that in a way where we protect, our basic sort of fundamental values, that we avoid this becoming full of biases, or is this, the scalability of having unlimited access to data, is that going to be an advantage to a place like China, to some extent to the US versus Europe? I think that's the big question out there. I remain optimistic that I don't necessarily see this as being a problem for the European Union in the next couple of years.
Casper, thanks. I just wanted to come back to Carmen, because you were weighing in. I can't remember whether you were weighing in just in response to Benedict or Casper or both.
Well, both of them. Very more Benedict that raised some issues to me. I would say that I partially agree with what you say, but I think AI requires a national strategy, because it is more than a technology. It's not yet another technology. AI is not just data, machine learning, computer, because it has not only technical implications or economic implications, it has society implications in such a level that we need to rethink our role as human beings in this new digital world, and it has also some ethical implications. So for me, that's why you're required to revisit the AI strategies as a country, as well to place your next national reserves. I mean, what are the key competitive factors of a country? What are our national reserves? It's energy, it's petrol, it's data, it's computing capacity, it's nurses, it's masks production. I mean, during the pandemic, we have realized that we had too much dependency on third-party global value chains, and also on third-party technology capacities from the European point of view. So Europe must redesign their whole AI strategy in terms of digital transformation, but also more than that. I think that AI has 4 important challenges that we need to be aware of. It has a technological challenge. We need to build AI which is robust, auditable, and explainable, so that we can trust it. Second, there is an important ethical challenge. We need to develop AI according to our principles and values as a society, and that will make the difference between the way AI is evolved or developed globally. There will be not just a uniform way of developing AI. We have seen that already. In the US, we see that data belongs to companies. In China, data belongs to governments. And we expect in Europe that data belongs to citizens. And that is really defining absolutely different way in the way we want to evolve or develop AI as a key competitive advantage for our companies, for our countries, and for our economies. Then we need, as also Casper mentioned, we have a regulatory challenge. We need to ensure a safe and trustworthy environment to develop AI, and we need to find the balance between ex ante and ex post regulation, not to kill a sector. We need to innovate. And that's important that as Europeans, we have this right balance. And then we have a social challenge, because it is important that we involve society in the governance of AI. What do we expect from AI? Do we self-censor ourselves because we don't want to authorize the use of facial recognition in open public places? So do we need to allow everything that technology can offer? And I don't think so. And I think the way we answer these questions is the way we are configuring our new society. And that has never happened in the past. Never technology had the power to alter the society and also the role of the human being, the society as now. And this is why Spain, in our national strategy, we want to claim for a human-centric development of AI. We put people on the center. And I think that's the way we make things different. We not only aim for scientific excellence and innovation, that of course is covered, that we need to develop advanced AI skills, that need to embed AI in the value chain of the existing economy, but also we need to put people on the center. And this is why we have elaborated the first chapter of digital rights that we want to promote at the European level and international level. So this chapter of digital rights is, what is the principles and values that we as a society want to define ourselves in this digital world?
I think it's so interesting. It's become a theme of today's conversation, what you're talking about, digital rights. We started with the professor of computing science at Oxford University and the founder of the Open Data Institute, Nigel Shadbolt, who was talking about exactly this point, institutional innovation. But I wonder if I might come and just bring in a couple of people who've made points that I think build on yours. Tim Gordon.
Just to point that and to finish, James, 1 minute. I agree that the vision of Benedict on digitalization, but I think we need to put it like in a funnel, like an innovation funnel. Right. And I think innovation is not as the result of investment in infrastructure, talent, and data. Innovation is also a national infrastructure, and we need to see it as a funnel. For example, there are some actions we need to do at the short term, which is how can we make people and companies adopt the technology that is already mature. Second is how can we transform digitally our value chain and business model. But the third part, and more important, is what do we need to invest today to create the disruptive changes that put our places in a competitive advantage of tomorrow. So I think like a story that needs to have like a vision, which is with the short term, mid-term, and long term.
So I think that the reason I was going to bring in Tim Gordon is I think he was making a point that, if I read it right, Tim, is a response to that, which is doing the AI or the machine learning is one thing, but you said in the chat that the digital plumbing is hard. Do you want to just describe what you mean by that digital plumbing?
Yeah, so if you think about the companies that do really well with AI, Google, for example, or Facebook, they basically built massive digital infrastructure, digital systems, where they've got huge amounts of data that flows through their organizations and their processes. And they put AI on top of that to basically optimize it and add the next 5% as they go through. So AI could be thought of almost as a better pump. And you're basically an automated pump that does things more effectively. But a pump on its own is no good if you don't have a pipeline and plumbing and so on to basically pump the data through. And that plumbing is essentially, you think about the business organization, the way you can monetize that. And that's really hard to get right. So we see for organizations trying to shift to using AI, building that digital plumbing is the complicated bit with legacy systems and so on. So you get that right, that's what gives you competitive advantage, almost more than the fact that you can use AI in the first place.
Interesting. Okay, Tim, thank you. I also just wanted to come to Lita McCall, if I could. Lita, the reason is you put a comment in the chat about access to finance. And, you know, sometimes when you see someone say something, you think, bingo, that is actually, certainly in the European context, because like one of the biggest issues here. Lita, will you tell me what you see here? And I'm going to go back to Azim to hear what he thinks on this.
Okay, hi, thanks for inviting me to talk. Basically, I'm wearing multiple hats here when I'm saying this. I was a startup entrepreneur that basically got overtaken by advantages in the medical domain. So my company didn't do as well, but I did have the experience of going through trying to acquire funding and where that funding may come from and investment and so on. Currently, I'm back in the academia. I'm working as a lecturer at the University of Glasgow. Basically, I was using AI for my technology development as an innovator, as an entrepreneur. And when I was trying to find investment, my experience was that almost at the end of every conversation, everyone was telling me, great technology, new IoT, new AI, all looks great. It would solve a real problem. But to get the millions of pounds you need to get this to market, you'd better talk to somebody across the water, go to the US. I live in Scotland, which is a smaller funding pot for investment than London is. But I suppose this can be a problem for many European countries. And my experience from my background as a Greek person is the same. If you really want big money to develop new ideas, it's easier to get that if you are in Silicon Valley. So to what extent does that affect our competitiveness, and then the index we're seeing, US being leading in all these technologies?
And by the way, Lita, this is a conversation that Alexandra Musavizadeh, who's the driver of our index, and I have had a lot, which is, are we calling the money right? Are we seeing where the money lands and at what stages in this? Azim, will you just talk to that? What do you think about the financing of innovation research in different countries, and how much, Benedict talked about where talent is going in the university sector. There's as good an analysis you could do, I imagine, on capital.
Well, it's a age-old story in Europe. Our level of innovation funding is low. Venture capital rates per capita in the UK are higher than in other places, but they're still far short of Israel and far short of the US. If you look at Chinese levels of venture capital and a per capita analysis is not exactly fair because the denominator is so big in China, but what really matters are the coastal cities. It's relatively high, but it's not just governments, it's also companies. I mean, if you look, one of the interesting things to track is the companies who've managed to get the data flywheel running and now have dominate the NASDAQ. So whether it's Salesforce in enterprise, or Apple or Google or Microsoft and Facebook, if you look at the amount they spend on R&D, it's going up, but it's also going up as a relative percentage of their already increasing revenues. So they have recognized that the future matters, and they have recognized that it makes sense to invest in the future. If you look at traditional industrial companies, as they get bigger, the amount that they invest in R&D declines as a percentage of revenue. And so they wonder why they're not prepared for the future when they're not investing in the future. I mean, there's a correlation, there is a relationship. And, R&D research.
Azim, forgive me, is that true with, as far as you can read it, with Chinese companies too? As in, are they closer to the European, reducing percentage, or the US increasing percentage?
So the only ones that I really follow are,
listed ones,
and Tencent and, the Pinduoduo. So I have no idea what all the state-owned enterprises are doing, but China has another model. And I think, we have to realize how crenulated this approach is. So when we start to see at the start of the pandemic, companies thinking about holding over dividends, and it was kind of news that BP, the oil companies, were going to reduce their dividends for the first time. And I sit there looking at the urgency of the oil transition and the fact that if you're an oil company, you're essentially sitting on dead assets. And I find it astonishing that these firms are going to pay any dividends at all, that they're not going to put every ounce of additional profit into turning themselves into carbon sinks and renewable energy businesses like Iberdrola is doing in Spain, for example. And so there has to be a mentality about how important is the future, and what are the tools that you have to prepare yourself for that future, whether it is the right kind of environment for entrepreneurship, whether it is the right kind of government risk-taking around funding basic research, whether it is how you enforce companies to take, or not enforce, pardon me, that's the wrong word, but incentivize or encourage companies to make the right levels of investment in the future, I think is a really critical aspect. There's an underlying process. I want to make two minor points. One, back to Lito's observation. There is an underlying challenge that of agglomeration, which is the fundamental process that means that talent kind of accrues in cities, it accrues in places. It's easier to invest where there are hotspots. Now, it may be that remote working, and it may be that successful innovation ecosystems start to spin out investors into places that are not the big cities and that are slightly further away from where the hotspots are. But there is this underlying process of agglomeration, which again, governments could step in and try to do something about, but I think it's a hard thing to do. And the final observation I would make is that, you know, when we think about what that future needs to look like, I think James, you started off saying this is about politics and this is about power. And I think we heard a couple of different versions of politics play out, right? One version is just equip people with education and allow entrepreneurs to be entrepreneurs and we get to great outcomes. Another version is to say, listen, we need a more balanced approach, because otherwise you end up in this situation where Henry Ford produces the Model T in 1915 and it's 1968 before it is mandatory to have seatbelts in cars, and 1984 before it is mandatory to wear them, just in one state in the US. I mean, it took 80 years. We went to supersonic flight quicker than that. So I think that we need to recognize that that this is a multi-factored problem that requires the kind of balanced approach that Carmine has started to lay out in what is quite a compelling vision.
Azim, thank you. I'm doing an absolutely catastrophically bad job of keeping to time, but I'm having too interesting a time to just to hit our marks on that. I want to just come back to Benedict Caspan and Carmen for just some final thoughts. Benedict, can I ask you one thing? The China model that Azim just touched on, I don't know whether you feel you've had time to kind of get a handle on what you think of it, but how much do you think it is going to catch up or even overtake the US?
So, well, sort of two observations. One is I am immensely skeptical of any kind of comparisons of R&D spending on almost any basis. And if you look at Apple's P&L, for example, everything below gross margin is categorized as either SG&A or R&D. So absolutely everything they do on any product is called R&D. That includes designing new boxes for the phones. Meanwhile, most of their advantage in chips comes from work done by TSMC in Taiwan. So I think it's really, really difficult to do kind of meaningful kind of comparisons of R&D across countries. I think the China, look, there's a sort of a super macro question here, which is look at GDP per capita around the world in 1500 and look at it today and look at it in 2100. And clearly that's the chart the Chinese leadership is looking at, and they think they're going to do to America what America did to Europe. They think they're going to be a bigger power. And some part of that is technology. And I would actually suggest that a much larger part of their technology conversation is about semiconductors and machine learning, because it's actually not very difficult to do machine learning. It's certainly not very difficult to take stuff that was published at NeurIPS 3 years ago and implement it. China has 20 companies making security cameras that can recognize people based on ethnicity so they can spot Muslims. And that's not Nobel Prize winning technology. It's just software. 5 years ago, it was amazing cutting edge stuff that no one could do. Now it's just software, and you can't stop them doing that. They will just make that software and put it in the cameras. To sort of another sort of aspect to that, this question of data, I keep thinking I should write an essay saying there's no such thing as data. And this is kind of something that's come across up frequently through this conversation. I think Carmen said, we need to have citizenship-owned data. Well, Siemens has a lot of telemetry data on gas turbines. Mm-hmm. WeChat has a lot of data on how Chinese people send messages to each other. Transport for London has a lot of data on people tapping their Oyster card as they go through the London transport system. That's all data. You can't put it in a pot and get HAL 9000 out of it. In fact, you can't put it in a pot and get supersonic aircraft out of it. There's no such thing as data. There's just lots and lots and lots, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different data sets, some of which you can get new things out of for that data set using machine learning.
Right.
And then to give you kind of your sort of general point on Chinese technology, I think, and I sort of alluded to this, but I'll kind of dig in on it just a little bit more. The thing that's really hard for China and important is getting to parity in semiconductors, where people who work in chips say China is 20 years behind. Right. And their ability to make the chips that go in, if you buy an iPhone, it's made in China. 95% of the value of the iPhone comes from outside China. All China's actually doing is assembling it. And so the camera comes from Japan, the screen comes from South Korea, the chip is designed in California, manufactured in Taiwan using equipment that comes from the Netherlands, from ASML, which is one of the only two European tech companies in the top 100 global companies by market cap. And so for China to catch up in chips, is actually much more difficult and strategically much more important for them, because that gets them to putting a guidance chip in a missile or in a jet fighter or in a drone or anything else. And so for China, like, machine learning is one piece of this conversation, but like there's a much larger China technology, China geopolitics, China diplomacy conversation, of which, like, how much messaging data does WeChat have is like, I don't care.
Well, Benedict, by the way, you definitely should. You should definitely write that piece. There's no such thing as data. If you want to write it for us, we'd love to have it. So, one final thought, and I'm cutting you off, Benedict, only because I see the time, and we've got the next session on talent at the top of the hour. Casper, a final thought from you on this is what is your prescription to Europe for competitiveness in this area?
Listen, I think there are different discussions happening in Europe right now, and to some extent between sort of personal data and non-personal data. And I think the big discussion in Europe, and also some of the projects that you've seen coming forward, the GaiaX project, we don't have enough time to talk about that, is based on this understanding that perhaps industrial data is an area where Europe can be, a global leader. My concern, speaking both with my current hat on, but also as a European, is that I think it's fundamentally important that this discussion and the catch-up game that Europe is in the middle of right now, that doesn't translate into, let's call, sort of a more protectionistic agenda where it's about building up walls and making it more difficult to sort of compete on a global scale. And I think the industrial data discussion is a good example where, if you talk about European industrial data, if you are a car manufacturer in Germany, or if you produce wind turbines in Denmark, the industrial data you generate is global industrial data. So I think a fundamental aspect of this discussion is to make sure that data transfer will be possible also in the future. And then you can add in the skilling discussions and the access to venture capital that others have mentioned, which is of course equally important. But I would just say, access to data is the fuel of AR, ML systems, and I think it's enormously important for all regions, but also for the European Union, to make sure that will still be feasible in the future.
Casper, thank you. And Karma, I'm going to give you the last word. What do you think about how you ensure competitiveness?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I just wanted to give you the last word on what you think you do to deliver competitiveness, to start to win in this race.
Yeah, I think that the word geopolitics is obsolete. We cannot just play geopolitics, which is limited to the physical place. It's geopolitics, the space politics, and cyber politics. So we need to preserve our competitive advantage, not only in the physical world and the rights of our citizens, not only in the physical world, also in their digital identities. Europe absolutely needs to rethink their industrial strategy because industries do not exist anymore. Verticals do not exist anymore because everything is going to be data. So all the companies, all the industry are not verticals anymore. They are either horizontals or ecosystems. And when everything is a data business, a car maker or a software company can compete in the car maker space, and a bank can compete in a retail space. And that's what we are witnessing these days, that your competitor comes from any orthogonal axis of the competition. You cannot see the competitor side by side because the difference between physical, digital, and data are blurring. So we need to think our industry in a different way. So the recovery of the European industry competitiveness needs a digital strategy. And of course, in the following years, we will see a lot of regulation on a way of doing things, like the Digital Services Act, which is regulating the role of the digital platforms, the Data Act, the governance data. And at the end of the day, it's just setting up the new pieces we want to build our competitive advantage. I agree with Casper that even though Europe has missed an important moment, regardless that we were not able to build digital giants basically on the B2C space on personal data, we still have opportunity to build that on other types of data. 80% of the data we will have in the data sphere in 2025 is yet to be produced. And 60% of that will come not for interactions with people with internet or people among us, it will be between things among us,
exactly.
things and things internet. And this is why Europe, that has made a bet on 5G, is probably having an opportunity to recover the control on the personal data based on the internet of proximity and having edge computing and data closer to the citizen and the smart cities and 5G networks. So I see that the need of a European digital sovereignty has to do with data sovereignty and building our own own capacities to develop software and develop intelligence out of that data. And I agree that it's going to be a global talent world. Europe must be a place where it must be attractive to invest, and we need to build more mechanisms for scaling up companies, because we have a matter of size. But I see that will make a difference, and especially in our Spain, I want just to point out two important focus. Yes, to combine.
I wanted to say thank you. I just want to forgive me for interrupting, but I just wanted to say thank you, because it's the top of the hour, and we could keep talking, but we're moving to the next key conversation, which is the conversation about talent. So I wanted to say a big thank you to you, Carmen Artigas, in Spain, Benedict Evans, Casper Klung, and Azim Azar, because this has been an absolutely mind-expanding conversation. I'm handing over now, it's 11 o'clock in London, to my colleague Alexi Mostras to discuss, I suppose, the subject that has been at the heart of this last hour, which is the intellectual capacity we're building and the competition for talent. So I hope that, seamlessly enough, I'm going to hand to you, Alexi, to introduce another extraordinary gang of speakers to take us into the next conversation. Thank you.